Welcome. I'm Shelley Fishkin. I'm director of the American Studies program at Stanford and affiliated faculty of the Towey Center for Jewish Studies. And it's a true pleasure and privilege to welcome you here this evening to hear Joan Nathan, the celebrated doyenne of Jewish cooking, give the Jewish Community Foundation the Jewish Community Federation Endowment Fund lecture at Stanford. I'd like to just start by thanking the programs and organizations co-sponsoring this evening's event with the Towey Center for Jewish Studies, and these include American Studies, Continuing Studies, Hillel at Stanford, the Jewish Students Association, the Stanford Cooking Society, and Alpha Epsilon Phi. I also want to thank Professor Charlotte Faurobert of Jewish Studies and Linda Wynn and Nicole Bridges from Jewish Studies, also Charlie Junkerman and Christine Fajardo from Continuing Studies, and Rabbi Serena Eisenberg and Jeremy Regent from Hillel for all they did to make this evening possible. Joan Nathan is the author of 10 cookbooks, including her most recent Quiches, Kugels, and Couscous, My Search for Jewish Cooking in France, which was named one of the 10 best cookbooks of the year by NPR, Food and Wine, and Bon Appetit. She's also a regular contributor to the New York Times, Food Arts Magazine, and Tablet Magazine. Her Jewish Cooking in America won both the James Beard Award for the Best American Cookbook and the IACP Julia Child Cookbook of the Year Award. The same James Beard Award was later awarded to her cookbook, The New American Cooking. Her other books include an American Folklife Cookbook, Foods of Israel Today, Joan Nathan's Jewish Holiday Cookbook, The Jewish Holiday Baker, the Children's Jewish Holiday Kitchen, The Jewish Holiday Kitchen, and The Flavor of Jerusalem. And she has a brand new book, there are cards in the front that's going to be out this April, called King Solomon's Table, with a foreword by Alice Waters. And I know every book of Joan's is a cause for celebration. I don't think this one will be any less than that. She served as the guest curator of Food Culture USA, the 2005 Smithsonian Festival on the National Mall in Washington, and her PBS series Jewish Cooking in America with Joan Nathan was nominated for a James Beard Award for the Best National Television Food Show. She's appeared as a guest on numerous radio and television programs, including The Today Show, Good Morning America, The Martha Stewart Show, and National Public Radio. An inductee to the James Beard Foundation's Who's Who in American Food and Beverage, she also received the Silver Spoon Award from Food Arts Magazine, an honorary degree from the Spertus Institute of Jewish Culture in Chicago, and the Golda Award from the American Jewish Congress. In 2011, she was awarded a special recognition award from the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research for her work to preserve Jewish foodways. And in 2015, Les Dames d'Escoffier awarded her the prestigious Grande Dame, an award recognizing professional achievement in the food industry, previously won by recipients including Julia Child, Marcella Hazen, and Alice Waters. Born in Providence, Rhode Island, Joan Nathan graduated from the University of Michigan with a master's degree in French literature and earned a master's in public administration from Harvard. For 3 years, she lived in Israel, where she worked for Mayor Teddy Kollek of Jerusalem. The mother of 3 grown children, she lives in Washington, D.C. and Martha's Vineyard with her husband and attorney Alan Gerson. Joan Nathan's cookbooks may be legendary, but she's much more than the author of acclaimed cookbooks. I'd call her a cultural historian of the first rank, with a gift for reconnecting food to the culture that produced it. She has a special talent for conveying the significance of food in Jewish culture and for giving readers the tools they need to participate themselves in that distinctive cultural nexus. In her book, Jewish Cooking in America, you won't find glossy photos of culinary perfection, but you'll find photos of people who made and enjoyed the food, whose family bonds were forged over the food, whose ancestors were remembered over the food. Instead of images of elegant table settings, there are pictures of a turn-of-the-century Jewish picnic in San Francisco, of shoppers in a Middle Eastern sweet shop for the Syrian community in Brooklyn, of child refugees from the Holocaust arriving in New York Harbor, of Jewish chicken farmers in New Jersey. You'll find the story of how Maxwell House Coffee got into the business of giving out Haggadahs, and the story of how Crisco was marketed as the answer to the kosher cook's dreams. The book is a living testament to the global reach of the Jewish diaspora and to the creativity with which Jews around the world have adapted local foodways to their own tastes and needs in America. Where else would one find Romanian Jewish polenta alongside Jewish-style enchiladas and tamales from Arizona? Moroccan brisket, Yemenite hot sauce, Turkish eggplant barikas, Alsatian onion tart, South Indian kosher cauliflower curry. This is a cookbook about food in America, remember. Ukrainian potato nick, Iraqi braised lamb, Bukharan lentils, Jerusalem kugel, Egyptian cake with orange flower water, Mississippi baked stuffed matzo balls, Georgian challah, Transylvanian cherry soup, Maine mock lobster salad, Syrian hamburgers, and the New Jersey kasha varnishkas. Joan Nathan shares with us the place of these foods in the Jewish families and communities that prepared them and provides recipes so clear that even I can follow them. She even adds to the mix foods she calls newish Jewish that show the continuing adaptability and innovation that give rise to new traditions. A translator with perfect pitch who dubs pretzel the focaccia of the Jews and calls kreplach Jewish wontons, Nathan is a writer who crafts her prose with the same care that many of the cooks she profiles craft their kugels. If the American Jewish community ever decided to adapt Japan's tradition of designating certain very special individuals living national treasures, I'd nominate Joan Nathan for that honor. The title of her talk tonight is The Latke and Civilization. Please join me in welcoming a remarkable cultural historian and terrific writer who has shaped our taste buds in profound and delicious ways.
Wow. I think my mother, who's 103, and I told her I was coming here. Actually, somebody here's mother's 2 doors down from my mother in Providence, Rhode Island. She was very excited that I was speaking at Stanford. She approved. Most of the time she thinks, why are you doing this? And she'd say, enough with these cookbooks. Anyway. I'm really pleased to be here. I've been looking forward to this ever since Shelley suggested the title of Latke and Civilization. She said I could say whatever I wanted. So when Shelley asked me to speak, she did suggest that I speak on Latke and Civilization. And I'm really pleased to be here for a number of reasons. First of all, it feels like coming home, but I've never spoken at Stanford before. I have spoken in Palo Alto many, many years ago. But I also like California a lot, and it's always an adventure when you come and you don't know who's going to be here or how you're going to react, and it's just fun. Anyway, but when we suggested Latke and Civilization, I didn't think that we would have so much just after Thanksgiving, and I'm not sure we're ready for latkes yet, but let's see how hungry you are after I finish. I'm going to try to use these, might help. Since latke is a Yiddish word coming from the Russian ladka, meaning little pancakes, let's use the word pancakes instead, because the pancake goes back to the dawn of civilization, before there was a concept of Judaism, and certainly no Yiddish. Wait, where's Jeremy? Okay, good. First slide. The earliest pancakes were for sure during the time of the myth, or rather the epic of Gilgamesh, and probably earlier, as chickpeas, one of the earliest sources of protein, were found at least 12,000 years ago in the Middle East. A Sumerian proverb from the time of Gilgamesh in about 2600 BC states, "Chickpea flour is appropriate for every woman in the palace." Of course, I thought when I read that. Cooks have been using gruels of flour and chickpea, think hummus, for morning breakfast for subsistence in the Middle East for thousands of years. To vary the diet, pancakes were made on flat slabs of clay over a fire greased with suet from beef, chicken fat, or oil from sesame seeds that were thought to, that was the first oil, seed oil. That were thought to have come from China and maybe sub-Saharan Africa to Babylon and Assyria at least 4,000 years ago. But for sure, the gluten-free chickpea was included in early pancakes in the Middle East. Next slide. But this is for my new book, by the way. But this humble griddle cake, like most foods, has been subject to the many changing global appetites that have long fueled civilizations. I just finished a cookbook as Shelley was saying, entitled King Solomon's Table, a culinary exploration of Jewish food around the world, for Alfred Knopf, coming out this April. If there's anything that I've learned in the process of writing it, to quote Ecclesiastic, supposedly written by King Solomon, of course, if King Solomon existed, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. Let's just say that before there was even the concept of monotheism, there were pancakes. And of course, this one, people like to say that it was invented in the 19th century, called farinata in Italy, and what's it called in French with an S? But anyway, in Soca in Nice. But this has been around forever. And even probably with fennel, it was around forever. And olives, not with tomatoes, but it has been around forever. I realize now that I could have gone back looking for the ancestor of latkes for thousands and thousands of years. But I chose to start my journey with an ancient text from Babylon, a cosmopolitan city even in the second millennium BCE, before worshiping just one god was even a thought. This earliest known cookbook contains 44 recipes inscribed in cuneiform in the Akkadian language on 3 clay tablets, the next slide, from about 1700 BCE. They are preserved at the Babylonian collection in the Sterling Memorial Library at Yale University. One fall day, I visited New Haven and met with Ulla Kasten, an archaeologist and the associate curator of the collection. I thought she was crazy to let me handle one of the beautiful tablets in my hand, smaller than our iPhones, but she did. The tablet felt cool and smooth to my touch. The complex writing looked impossible to comprehend. I had read about the tablets in The Oldest Cuisine in the World, a fascinating book by Jean Bottero, so I knew they included recipes for stews, even borscht, vegetables, lots of flatbreads, literally pancakes, giving us clues to diet in the ancient Fertile Crescent. Although these recipes list exotic ingredients like the spice kubeb, which tastes very similar to allspice, and pigeon, and many not deciphered yet, and descriptions for elaborate feasts for thousands of people in honor of kings and gods, it is the staple ingredients like lentils, chickpeas, sesame seeds, dill, cumin, coriander, nigella seeds that give us a sense of what was available back then to those early Mesopotamians. Next. Ulla showed me a copy of a map dating back to the 3rd or 2nd millennium BCE, when people were sailing on the oceans, mostly the Indian and Arabian Oceans, because they were really the center of traffic until the 11th century. As soon as the 11th century, it shifted to the Mediterranean. It's fascinating. And leading caravans of camels and what we now call the Silk Road, traveling from Anatolia and the Levant all the way to Jiangxin in northwestern China. Describing to me the extent of trade in ancient times, she had me gazing at examples of bronze pots with intricate designs from Persia and almost identical Chinese pots made of porcelain found in Cyprus. Clearly, merchants were learning recipes from one another as they were bartering sesame seeds, cinnamon, ginger, turmeric, dried chickpeas, and whatever else they could transport. Meanwhile, 200 years or so after this period, and about 400 years before the alleged birth of King Solomon, in about 1400 BCE, 700 miles south of Babylon in the cosmopolitan city of Ur, the Bible tells us there lived a shepherd named Abram, later to be called Abraham, an early adherent of monotheism. Heeding the word of God, he gathered his wife, brother, nephew, and servants, along with cows, goats, and probably provisions like dried chickpeas and sesame seeds, and left his native city, setting out for Canaan, later described as a land of milk and honey, actually yogurt and date jam. The book of Deuteronomy also tells us that Canaan flowed with figs, dates, olives, grapes, pomegranates, barley, and wheat. And here Abraham and Sarah used what they grew up with and brought seeds and dried and salted ingredients with them from Babylonia, integrating these ingredients and skills into the foods of their new home. Later, their grandsons and their descendants would add more foods from Egypt, such as fava beans, melons, cucumbers, and leeks, into their cooking. They learned from the Egyptians how to make bread from beer yeast, the art of force-feeding geese for foie gras, and other ways of using different grains, like fricka, the parched wheat of the Bible. Thanks to hieroglyphics, archaeological digs, and the Bible, we have records of how, during the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt, these foods were integrated into the Hebrew way of life before the Exodus, if it happened, and subsequently brought back with them to the land of Israel. Next slide. Little is known about King Solomon, and some scholars even doubt his existence, but his story offers an image of a ruler presiding over a diversity of cultures, an abundance of food, and reaching beyond his borders to feed his kingdom. In the biblical account, Solomon was a large exporter of wheat and olive oil, which he bartered to the Phoenician king Hiram in return for timber and the use of skilled workmen. Solomon is said to have ruled for 40 years, amassing enormous wealth. With a ravenous appetite for all aspects of life, he supposedly had 700 wives, including of the daughter of the Pharaoh, and over 300 mistresses. The biblical book of Kings tells, and this was somebody who was at Stanford that gave me all this information, Stephen Wiseman, who's now at the University of Pennsylvania. The biblical book of Kings tells that some of his wives came from Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Edom, present-day Jordan, Sidon, present-day Lebanon, and Anatolia, present-day Turkey, the lands near and surrounding Judea and ancient Israel. These women likely would have brought pomegranates, dates, olives, and a variety of other foods and methods for preparing them, including lots of various variations of pancakes not served with maple syrup, but savory pancakes made from chickpea flour, wheat, or barley, with a different spice here, a different ingredient there. Don't forget, this was the world. They didn't know about any other parts of the world. According to tradition, the 12 tribes of Israel brought even more variety to the land. Each tribe tithed the king and his family with jewels, minerals, exotic materials, and new foods and spices for 1 month a year. Our mythology of Solomon and his reign overflows with global appetites from the then-known world, and without television, the internet, or iPhones, local appetites were fueled by visitors with seeds and chickpeas, a tasty and particularly drought-resistant crop in their pockets, and hungry conquerors from other lands. I'm telling you all of this because I believe Solomon, or the image of Solomon, or the idea of Solomon, gives us a glimpse into the reasons the Jews like to eat so much. Jewish food is unlike the cuisine of empires, influenced by the cultures they vanquished, or national cuisines that have a homeland or stable center with defined boundaries. In a sense, it's a rootless food. But as a wandering people, Jews have influenced many different local cuisines as they carried their foods to new lands via Jewish trade routes, while fleeing prejudice in search of safer lands, or while migrating in search of new opportunities. Yet regional and global influences on the food Jews ate remained circumscribed by allegiance, no matter how strict, to the laws of kashrut and by the rituals for Hanukkah and other holidays. I know about the global influence from my travels in search of Jewish cuisine, but a similar tale can be told also from a Lebanese, Indian, or let's say Armenian perspective, and more. Next. It's so great to have somebody else doing this. In all the early civilizations, using olive oil, as well as, let's say, oil from the sheep's tail, or coconut oil. We know Jews were the processors of it in places like Ceylon by the 1st century or so. Was more important for light than for cooking, especially during the winter time. In the land of Israel, olives were typically harvested and pressed in the late fall, which is why every year as winter began, the people of the Middle East held a festival, thanking the gods and then God for the gift of oil and light. And this, of course, during the darkest point of the year. These celebrations were very much part of the lives of the early Hebrews and became the basis of what we now know as Hanukkah, an ancient celebration that was at its origin as much a celebration of the olive and its juices as it was of the miracle of oil itself. Hanukkah, of course, commemorates the famous miracle in 164 BCE when Judah Maccabee and his brothers found a drop of oil in the Temple of Jerusalem just after the Assyrians had devastated it. This little drop lasted not 1 but 8 days and was assuredly a drop of olive oil, since we know that olive trees have been common in Israel since the time of Adam and Eve, whenever that was. It was during the Middle Ages, and the more that you read about the ancient world, the more you realize that that these were myths. A myth of a wise man like Solomon was way, way back before Solomon. The flood was way, way back before the flood, and you find a lot of them in Gilgamesh. So that I personally think that and I don't really, here I'm with all these academics, that our civilization was repeated many, many, many centuries before we even thought about it, and that that things didn't change as quickly as they're changing today, so that processes of cooking lasted much longer than they do today. It was during the Middle Ages, as ancient Jews spread out from the Middle East and into Europe, that Hanukkah evolved, and actually in the Middle Ages during the rise of Catholicism, that Hanukkah evolved from a distinctly minor temple festival to a major family one, during which the Shulchan Aruch forbids fasting and mourning and encourages singing and rejoicing, many say in competition with the celebration of Christmas. To this day, traditional Jews light Hanukkah menorahs with olive oil instead of candles, as a reminder of the oil, but also its seasonal harvest. With it, they cook symbolic fried dishes, many of them desserts. Greek women claim that their lokomadas, deep-fried puffs dipped in honey or sprinkled with powdered sugar, resemble the cakes the Maccabees ate, while Persian Jews prefer zelebi, a snail-shaped deep-fried sweet. Israeli sufganiyot, which have replaced most of these sweets today as the celebratory sweet, are basically raised jelly donuts and were adapted from the Greek lokomadas and Austrian Pfannkuchen. On the savory side of these traditional fried treats is, of course, the potato pancake. Now, a sufganiyot, I believe, was started by Eliezer ben Yehuda. He took a Greek word, I think it was sufgan, meaning, where's Dan? Sufgan meaning sponge, and then also like a donut, so that it was like a sponge that you could put oil in it. And they wanted to have an old name for something that was absolutely new. They didn't want to do a latke because that was something that was Europe. And also, when you think about it, a potato latke was something for a cold part of the world, where you really needed potatoes, where you didn't get a lot of vegetables. Anyway, all right, I wish I didn't need glasses, but anyway, I do. Today, Israel is the international center of latkes, or levivot, the generic term in Hebrew for all manner of vegetable, barley, flour, or chickpea pancakes. The story of Judah Maccabee and his brothers overpowering the fierce Syrian army so appealed to the nationalism of the early Zionists that they turned Hanukkah, traditionally a minor holiday, into a patriotic festival. The symbolism behind the latke is threefold. Made initially of flour and water, or a flour and water, they were a reminder of the food hurriedly prepared for the Maccabees as they went to battle before their military victory. The oil in which the pancakes are prepared symbolized the cleansing and rededication of the temple after it was defiled by the Assyrian general Holofernes. According to the stories, just after this desecration, Judith, a Hebrew woman, made Holofernes a cheese pancake so salty it induced him to drink glass after glass of wine. When Holofernes was nice and drunk, Judith then cut off his head, thus delivering her people from the Assyrians. The pancake is central to this gory story, and thus the latkes signify the victory of her chastity and humility over the lust and pride of Holofernes, who would have had the Jews slaughtered had Judith not fed him so well and given him so much wine that he fell asleep. Of course, I imagine that those cheese pancakes were not at all like the sweet cheese latkes eaten and beloved by Hungarian Jews. The cheese was more like what the Bedouin women sell in Jerusalem today, salt-dried curd cheese rehydrated for use in the winter, and thus very, very salty, mixed with flour and water and maybe egg, salty enough to make the general drink a lot. We typically associate the modern latke with potatoes, but levyvot have been around in the old world for much longer than the potato. The story of how this spud came into potato latkes is much like the story of King Solomon and his kingdom, one of goods and recipes traveling throughout the then known world. As I thumbed through the many potato recipes in a family cookbook written in the early 20th century from the Nathan family, I recalled my father telling me stories he had learned in school in Bavaria about the American-born Sir Benjamin Thompson, also called Count Rumford. A British loyalist who fled to England after the American Revolution, Count Rumford became head of the Bavarian army and reorganized it, encouraging the chefs in a cookbook that he wrote to cook potatoes for human consumption rather than tossing them to animals. Although the Spanish conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada brought potatoes from Peru to Spain in the mid-1500s, 100 years later, the potato was still, like corn and Jerusalem artichokes, regarded as better suited for livestock than humans. The Russian Orthodox Church even looked down on consumption of the human humble spud, noting that there is no mention of potatoes in the Bible. Prussian King Frederick II, more fondly known as Frederick the Great or Old Fritz, saw the budding potential of using potatoes to feed the masses and providing cuttings for the peasants to grow. During the 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, Antoine Augustin Parmentier, a pharmacist from Paris, was captured by the Prussians and forced to eat only potatoes to survive. Although the experience was less than pleasant, his time in prison and the role the potato had certainly played in his sustenance led him in 1772 to propose the potato as a nourishing food for those suffering from dysentery. Shortly after, Paris's Faculty of Medicine declared potatoes edible, and at an auspicious moment no less, potatoes started to be planted in France. As famine led to the French Revolution and subsequent reign of terror, potatoes planted in the Tuileries Gardens and other places in Paris saved the day, or at least the stomachs. By the beginning of the 19th century, potatoes were being added to recipes all around Europe, but still were a harder sell than tomatoes and peppers. Parmentier encouraged people to eat potatoes by serving them at fancy dinners for the Parisian elite and visiting foreigners such as Benjamin Franklin. Eventually, the French got used to and even enjoyed eating potatoes, especially when they learned that they were cheaper than flour. And for many of the best French chefs today, potatoes are a favorite vegetable. At about the same time, the Jewish communities of southern Galicia, a former kingdom in between Poland and Ukraine, caught on to potatoes, which soon worked their way into cholent, kugels, and of course, potato pancakes. There was even a poem about potatoes, Mana, I forget what it's called, but potatoes every single day of the week that you would eat them. Ukrainian pancakes were called latkes, Dan, this is where you come in, by Yiddish-speaking Jews, and were a cheap and delicious way to use up the potatoes left over in the cellar over the winter. These were fried in chicken fat or schmaltz to celebrate the miracle of oil at Hanukkah. And again, this was a Christian country. You don't find these in Sephardic countries or southern Middle Eastern countries even. The word latke itself derives from the Russian oladya. You can always tell where a food really is from by the derivation of the word, so that linguistically, this sort of roamed around a lot because it's from the Russian oladya, which comes from the Greek oladia, the plural of oladion, which means a little oily thing, which comes from alaya, which means olive. But of course, the latke was not just an Eastern European thing or even just a Jewish thing. So you can see that it doesn't come from Russia, it came from someplace else, anyway. Almost every country throughout Europe has its own version of the latke. In fact, the potato latkes I'm using in a New York Times article later this month came originally from a French potato pancake called a pomme d'arfin. Have you ever heard of it? No. Maybe you have. Has anyone ever heard of it? A pomme d'arfin? Did somebody? Not dauphin, darphin. D-A-R-P-H-I-N. Well, read my article. It wasn't until the waves of immigrants from Eastern Europe came to the United States that a wide group of people even used the name Latke. German Jews would have used the German word Kartoffelpfannkuchen, while Hungarian Jews made dishes like plaki, flat potato pancakes smothered in goulash, a spicy tomato beef stew. Remember that. In Aunt Babette's cookbook of 1906, one of the first Jewish cookbooks in America, there's no entry for latkes, but rather simply the American potato pancakes. And it said, pare large potatoes the night previous if you intend them for breakfast, and lay them in cold water overnight. Aunt Babette. I believe she was the sister-in-law of the publisher, Block Publishing. Does anybody know who's from Chicago? Anyway, but she was a German Jew. Grate them in the morning and pour off all the water you can. Salt liberally, add a spoonful of flour and a few eggs beaten together. Heat butter and griddle, bake a nice brown, and have the cakes as thin as possible. Eat with tomato preserves. In cold weather, have all the breakfast plates heated. When eggs are very high in price, your potato cakes will taste almost as good without. In the 1930 edition of the Settlement Cookbook, first put out as a fundraising cookbook for the Jewish Settlement House in Milwaukee in, I believe, 1901, there's a similar recipe for potato pancakes with applesauce. The 1946 edition still doesn't use the word latke, but does use the new convenience food product, matzah meal, that was mass-produced in the 20s by Manischewitz, often used as an American substitute or a Jewish substitute for breadcrumbs. It was only in 1952 that the venerable New York Times used the word latke in what they described as, quote, a golden brown potato pancake that was served to the Jewish troops in Korea by the military thanks to efforts of the National Jewish Welfare Board. Perhaps people were more tolerant of Jewish jargon and customs after the Holocaust. You know, I think that not using the Eastern European term for latke was done on purpose. I really think that people became more comfortable about being, at first they were afraid after the war, and then they got to be more used to it and more comfortable. And also there wasn't television just yet. Perhaps people were more tolerant, this use of the word in a mainstream publication made American Jews more comfortable. And by 1993, when 6 times the word latke was used in the New York Times, Jewish food came of age for foodies when that year Wolfgang Puck, an Austrian cook, held his first Passover Seder at Spago in Los Angeles, largely because of his then-wife Barbara Lazaros, a self-described Jewish broad from the Bronx. His Passover menu, the New York Times tells us, included potato latkes. It is in the United States then, over the course, remind me to tell you a story about him later. It is in the United States then, over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, that the latkes become the symbolic food of Hanukkah. Although Christians made potato dishes all the time, as did Jews, at Hanukkah, Jews had only their latkes, while Christians had their gingerbread houses, Christmas pudding, roast pork, and so many other dishes. After all, how can a latke compare with Christmas cookies or a Christmas tree? Except for the smell. Whenever I want to sell cookbooks at Hanukkah or Christmas, I fry potato latkes with a little onion and the people come a-running. But even amongst Jewish people, there are contemporary distinctions between the Ashkenazic and Sephardic communities' celebrations of Hanukkah. I remember talking with the late Edgar Nathan III, president of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue of New York and a descendant of one of the first American Sephardic families, who could not remember a latke tradition in his family. I mean, I was shocked. He never had potato pancakes. It was, after all, and he was married to somebody who was, her maiden name was Gottesman. She was sort of a Hungarian, but I don't know. It was, after all, not until the 16th century that potatoes were discovered and brought from Bolivia and Peru to Western Europe, not eaten until the 18th and 19th centuries. But that by that time, the Nathans, because of the Inquisition, had left Spain. Culinary tradition, as I always say, die hard in families. And where's the term I was trying to remember before? Who's the teacher of who teaches American food customs? Johnson. What's her first name? And it's culinary lag. Well, I'll talk to you about that later. Okay. All right. Today, in our ever-expanding world of food, we have apple cheddar latkes, latke-crusted turkey stuffing fritters with liquid cranberry core and schmaltz gravy, latke pumpkin pie, Brussels sprout latkes, latkes topped with egg Benedict, caviar or goat cheese, potato and zucchini latke waffles, latke poutine topped cheese curds and gravy from Canada, sunchoke latkes. Let's look at the next one. This is from my new book. Oh no, this is the potato. Then let's do one more, the spud. And this is chili poblano latkes, sweet potato latkes with candied pecans and brown sugar syrup, persimmon latkes, grilled cheese latkes, and of course, popular this year more than ever before, you will see those ancient gluten-free chickpea latkes. As King Solomon said, there really is nothing new under the sun. With all these creative varieties, I still must confess that I still love a good, simple, crispy potato latke with homemade applesauce. Who would have thought, though, that such a humble dish would not only taste so delicious, but also embody the entire history of the Jewish people and more, all topped with sour cream or applesauce. And one more photograph. Okay. Thank you very much. So, do we have questions?
Thank you so much for that terrific talk. We do have time for some questions.
Okay, we have time for questions. Anything you want to ask?
I have a mic. Tell a story about Wolfgang Puck.
Oh, well, when I was doing my TV series, I asked him if he would be in it, and he said, of course he would be. So we were at, what's the place in San Francisco where his restaurant was? Yeah, I think, yeah, Post-Trio. That's right, exactly. And there was a pizza oven there, and so there were these 3 pita breads that were cooking in the oven, or he had 4, and one of them fell out, and I was thinking, how can I talk about something Jewish to Wolfgang Puck? So I said, those 3 pita bread, they look like the 3 cakes that Sarah made for the angels that were visiting her and Abraham. And he looked at me and he said, you mean Sarah Jessica Parker? So we didn't put that. My producer thought it just showed how ignorant he was. He didn't want to put it in there. Any other questions? Okay.
So, my grandmother's latke recipe, which of course I regard as the only proper one, she came from Russia, but she ended up in Mobile, Alabama.
Oh, good.
And her latkes, she always put a teaspoon of baking powder. So they come out sort of puffy. And I've never seen that in anybody else's recipe. And I wondered, have you ever come across that?
I have not come across that, or I probably have. Yeah, there have been some people use there's a little bit of flour or matzah meal, and they'll put a little bit of baking powder. But I think that what you have to do is look in a lot of the old cookbooks, like there's a cookbook from Alabama, I think it was called the 20th Century Cook, and I'll bet you anything it's in that book. And it might have been in a later issue of, let's say, Aunt Babette's cookbook, when a baking powder company, because they came into existence at the end of the 19th century. So they wanted to, it was one of our early processed foods, and that people wanted to use. So yes. Any other questions? How else did she make it?
Well, she put the potatoes in a blender, so instead of being like hash browns, they have a much different texture.
Uh-huh. I'll try it. Okay.
Hi. Why do you think the latke survived the Holocaust and became like secularized when other old country foods like cholent and kvass and borscht did not.
Well, the first thing that's a great question. I think the first thing, borscht seems a little weird. Cholent did survive. People that are religious use it. You go to B'nai Barak or any of those places, it's everywhere. But I think, does anybody know the answer to this one? What is the one, well, I'll just tell you. It's the Cuisinart. That's what really saved the latke, because people like my mother, I mean, the Cuisinart was invented in about the early 1970s. And I remember I bought it instantly. I was able to get it wholesale. I remember Julia Child, who I knew at that time, said to me, listen, she always liked to bargain, and so do I. She said, you can get, because I had written a cookbook, nobody knew who I was, and so she said, you can get it wholesale. And the minute she said wholesale, I just bought it. And, but it was for the, it was, you could grate, you could, it was the same. Why do you think people started making hummus? You couldn't buy packaged hummus because of the Cuisinart, or pesto because of the Cuisinart. But I think because people love potatoes. And again, and it was also because, okay, there was the Holocaust. Then after the Holocaust, we were in a culture where it was a Christian culture for the most part, and we had to compete with Christmas in some way. And in the United States, in Israel, it's mostly sufganiyot. It is not. There might be all kinds of levivot, but not necessarily potato levivot. Again, it's a hot climate. They've got a lot more fresh ingredients than we do. It's cold climate food. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? I love this. I love it when you ask. Yes. Listen.
How do you prepare latkes in advance and still keep them crispy and hot?
Okay. Well, I don't want to give anything away, but look at my article when it comes out. But one of the things you can do is you make them in advance and then keep them in a low oven for a while well, not on a paper, but drain them first, keep them in an oven, or make them way in advance, freeze them, and then put them in a 350 oven for about 20 minutes. And they'll, because there's nothing worse than, as far as I'm concerned, than going to a person's Hanukkah party where they're making all these greasy latkes in a frying pan where they're so impatient for the latkes to get done that they crowd them all together, and all they do is they're fat. And it's not even appealing to look at. So, yeah, I do them in advance. That's what I try to do. Any other questions? Yeah?
Is that the way to keep them crispy too?
Well, okay. When I do them,
that's really the
yeah, I like
trick.
There's some. Well, I love them crispy. So what I do is I do what the French do, and I sort of pat them down, and you could use grapeseed oil, or you can use whatever you want, but to get it high, and then you pat them down so that I like them to be thinner and crispy, very crispy, but not too thin. Oh, look at it. Yeah.
What about using a combination of chopped potatoes as well as the grated ones? I've seen people.
You can do chopped potatoes and the grated, but you can also do something that I've done is I make mashed potato pancakes, and they're right, except they're not as good because you want that crispy taste. But if you don't want them to be that fatty, so you make the mashed potatoes and then you just have it crisped outside. But you can do a very grated and then not so grated. But you've got to have the onions in. You've got to have the onions. Yeah.
So until my grandmother passed away, she was the one who would make the latkes at Hanukkah.
Yeah.
And now it's my father, who's a goy, who's making the latkes. But he got my grandmother's blessing before she passed away. So at what point is a latke, and what point is a latke just something more than a latke?
Well, it sounds to me as if yours already has a a story behind it. So that's part of what makes a latke a latke. Latke is, you know, the thing about Jewish food, it's, first of all, there are a lot of jokes, right? Whenever there's Jewish food. And family making these dishes, just what you just told, you're going to tell your kids these stories. And that's what makes Jewish food, or any, you know, it doesn't have to be just Jewish food, but it's family food. And that, to me, is really the most important thing that we can do, that we can still, you know, not just get carry out of sushi or whatever. I mean, you don't want, you know, the role of parent is to create memories for children. And you're not going to get memories from sushi. And even though, like, the other day my son and I were cooking together, and it was in my daughter's kitchen, which is too small, and I was hitting my head on things, and I was thinking, you know, there's tension before food comes out, but in the end, you're cooking, and you're cooking together, and that's what you're going to remember, and that's so important for all of us, because we live in a world where everyone is on their iPhone. I'm so happy I didn't see any iPhones tonight. They're on their iPhones. Their world is concentrated about their computer, and honestly, I feel as if I have this little basket next to my dining room table. When people come over, I tell them to deposit, and believe me, I have a lot, because I live in Washington. These are not high level, but a lot of journalists, and the only person I've never been able to get him to relinquish his cell phone, he'll kill me for saying this, is Wolf Blitzer, because he always has to have it. He's always, and I think, you know, you're not so important. I mean, so, but anyway, they all, you know, in Washington they do that, and I can't stand it, because you forget who you're talking to people, you're doing something that's, and I think personally, the reason Passover is so popular is because people get, you can talk to each other. I think we desperately need it, and especially the young kids need it, because they need, again, they've got to create memories rather than just in restaurants.
Your preferred choice of oil for schmaltz?
Well, I actually like olive oil, but I think we're used to olive oil, but that's what the early Jews used, is olive oil. Except if they were in Eastern Europe, there was no olive oil. It was very expensive. So
you're saying that matzah meal came in around the 20s?
Well, look, there was always matzah meal, but matzah meal, if you lived in Eastern Europe, the way that you would buy matzah meal is you would all go to a small town. There'd be a baker, a Passover bakery. I mean, I found them in Greece. I found them in France, in the south of France. There would be the synagogue would very often have a matzah bakery in the synagogue, and you would make your food. I mean, let me just think. You would buy, let's say you had 5 people in your family. So you figure a pound of matzah per person. So you get 5 pounds of matzah. You'd go to the bakery and you'd take them home. And, you know, they were not the square matzahs. They were round matzah. They were uneven. And there'd be leftover, and that would be your matzah meal. Or you would have something like a big butter churn. And you would, my mother-in-law, who was from Zamość, Poland, she would go like this. She'd show me this whenever she'd see something like this butter churn, and you would mash your matzahs. And she said to me, she said, lately, which was in the 30s in Zamość, lately, she would always say that, Manischewitz matzah meal came to Poland. This was just before the war. And so that's, but I knew it was in the late 20s, early, that they manufactured it. Any other questions?
So, why and when did applesauce versus sour cream come about, and then your personal preference, of course?
Well, probably was always, again, very early on in the 20th century, there was this man named, what was his name? Joseph Jacobs, his name was, and he would. He took, he would go to non-Jewish customers like Maxwell House, and he'd say to Maxwell House, why don't you, everyone thinks that coffee beans aren't kosher, and why don't you have the Maxwell House Haggadah with coffee beans on it, and then they'll realize they are kosher for Passover. So he was somebody who, and there were a lot of Yiddish and English cookbooks. So he would try to make these what do you call it? To make the products that you would use them for Jewish customers. So I'm sure that applesauce, like Mott's applesauce or some sort of applesauce, was one of them. And of course, Jews always like sour cream for dairy meals. So it was either applesauce or sour cream. But you know, now a lot of people use creme fraiche, or they use goat cheese, or you'll see what I have in the New York Times. Okay.
So my mother was from Poland and generally rejected any kind of food that was not sort of viable at a market, you know, that was any kind of prepared food. But nayafet was a staple in our household, and it seems that it became sort of central to some part of American Jewish cooking, and then it disappeared, and my knedlach have never been the same.
So wait a minute, nayafet was...
So I think it was made by Manischewitz, but I don't know if anybody else.
But was it like, was it probably like Crisco?
Yeah, it was like that, but...
You know, when Crisco first came out, Procter & Gamble had this advertisement that Jews have been waiting 4,000 years for Crisco. So, but I think that it was for more religious Jews probably that bought the nayafet. And my guess is that Crisco just dominated. I mean, and it's ironic that now Crisco is no longer owned by Procter & Gamble. I forget what company owns it. But they're also doing, the same company that's doing it is also doing coconut oil that looks like Crisco, right? Which, of course, everybody wants to use. Okay.
Every year I used to make latkes for 100 students here on campus. And the Korean students would recognize latkes as being very similar to a Korean dish. And so in addition to applesauce and sour cream, we had to have soy sauce.
Oh, how interesting. That's great. Well, thank you. You've been a wonderful audience.
Thank you so much. That was terrific.